Have you ever wondered why some words stick to you like shadows while others simply bounce off like raindrops on glass? There's a woman in Portland, Oregon who discovered something profound about the voices that shape us, and her story might change how you listen to the world around you forever. Sarah Martinez was 32 when she realized that the loudest voice in her head wasn't even her own, and what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about who you really are beneath the layers of what others have told you to be. We all carry invisible scripts written by people who thought they knew us better than we know ourselves. Some of these voices belong to parents who meant well, but planted seeds of doubt. Others come from friends who disguised their own insecurities as helpful advice. And then there are those voices that cut the deepest, the ones that come from people who never loved us but somehow convinced us their opinions mattered more than our own heartbeat. Sarah's story begins in a place many of us know too well, standing in front of a bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning, wondering when she started believing that everyone else's version of her was more real than the woman staring back with tired eyes and a heavy heart. The thing about voices that control us is that they rarely announce themselves as intruders. They slip in quietly, disguised as truth, wearing the mask of care or concern. Sarah's particular collection of voices had been building for decades, each one adding another layer to the person she thought she was supposed to be. Her mother's voice reminded her that she was too sensitive, too emotional, too much of everything that made life harder than it needed to be. Her ex-husband's voice told her she was selfish for wanting a career that meant something to her, that she was failing at the most important job a woman could have. Her sister's voice suggested she was being dramatic when she talked about feeling lost, that everyone felt that way sometimes, and she just needed to get over it. But the voice that hurt the most belonged to someone who had never even met the real Sarah. It was the voice of a supervisor who had made it her mission to destroy Sarah's confidence at work. Someone who seemed to find genuine pleasure in pointing out every mistake, every moment of uncertainty, every human flaw that made Sarah question whether she belonged anywhere at all. This woman, Linda, had a way of speaking that sounded professional on the surface, but carried an undertone of cruelty that made Sarah feel small and incompetent every single day. Linda would make comments about Sarah's presentations in front of the entire team, suggesting that maybe Sarah wasn't quite ready for the responsibilities she had been given, that perhaps she needed more training before she could be trusted with important clients. The insidious thing about psychological manipulation is how it works slowly, like water wearing away stone. Linda never said anything that could be reported to human resources or written up as harassment. She was too smart for that, too calculated in her cruelty. Instead, she would ask questions that sounded concerned but were designed to undermine, like wondering aloud whether Sarah had really thought through her proposal or if she was sure she wanted to present it to the board in its current state. She would offer to help in ways that made Sarah feel like a burden, volunteering to double-check her work because it was so important to get things right. She would smile when she delivered these verbal cuts, making Sarah doubt whether she was being too sensitive, whether she was imagining the malice that felt so real in her chest. Month after month, Sarah found herself changing to accommodate these voices. She started second-guessing every decision, every instinct, every moment of natural confidence that tried to surface. She would spend hours preparing for meetings that should have taken minutes, rehearsing every word because Linda had convinced her that her natural way of speaking wasn't professional enough. She began to dress differently, speak more quietly, take up less space in rooms where she had every right to belong. She started apologizing for things that weren't her fault, for existing in spaces that felt too small for the person she was trying to become, for having opinions that didn't match what others expected from her. The voices became so loud that Sarah couldn't hear herself anymore. When someone asked her what she wanted for dinner, she would panic because she had become so used to deferring to others that her own preferences felt foreign and unreliable. When friends asked what she enjoyed doing in her free time, she would draw a blank because she had spent so much energy trying to be what others needed that she had forgotten what brought her joy. The woman who had once known exactly what she believed about life, love, and everything in between had become a stranger to herself, a collection of other people's expectations wearing her name like an ill-fitting costume. It was on a particularly difficult Tuesday that everything changed. Sarah had just left another meeting where Linda had publicly questioned her competence, suggesting in front of senior management that perhaps Sarah's project timeline was too ambitious for someone with her level of experience. Sarah found herself in the parking garage, sitting in her car with tears streaming down her face when she noticed an elderly woman struggling with her grocery bags near the elevator. Without thinking, Sarah got out to help, and the woman looked at her with such genuine gratitude that it cut through the fog of self-doubt that had become Sarah's normal state. The woman, whose name was Eleanor, had wise eyes and a gentle way of speaking that reminded Sarah of her grandmother. As Sarah helped carry the bags to Eleanor's car, the older woman mentioned that she was a retired therapist who had spent 40 years helping people find their way back to themselves. Something in Sarah's expression must have conveyed her pain because Eleanor paused and asked if she was okay. Really okay. Not just the automatic response people give when they're drowning, but don't want to burden anyone else with their struggles. Standing there in a concrete parking garage that smelled like exhaust and frustration, Sarah found herself telling a complete stranger about the voices that had taken over her life. She talked about how she used to know who she was, how she used to trust her own judgment, how she used to move through the world with a confidence that now felt like a distant memory. Eleanor listened with the kind of attention that had become rare in Sarah's life, the kind that made her feel seen rather than judged, heard rather than diagnosed, understood rather than fixed. Eleanor shared something that would change everything for Sarah. She talked about how our minds are like radios that can tune into different stations, and how sometimes we get stuck on frequencies that were never meant for us. She explained that the voices of criticism and control often come from people who are broadcasting their own pain, their own insecurities, their own unhealed wounds onto anyone who will receive the signal. The problem isn't that we're weak for hearing these voices, Eleanor said, but that we've forgotten how to change the channel back to our own authentic frequency. That conversation in the parking garage became the beginning of Sarah's journey back to herself. Eleanor became an unexpected mentor, meeting Sarah for coffee every Thursday morning to talk about the process of separating other people's voices from her own inner wisdom. Eleanor taught her that healing from psychological manipulation isn't about building walls to keep everyone out, but about developing the discernment to know which voices deserve a place in your inner conversation and which ones are just noise that needs to be turned down. The work wasn't easy or quick. Sarah had to learn to notice when she was operating from someone else's script instead of her own authentic responses. She practiced catching herself when Linda's voice would start its familiar litany of doubt and criticism, learning to pause and ask whether this voice was helping her grow or just keeping her small. She began to challenge the automatic thoughts that had become so familiar they felt like truth, questioning whether her mother's definition of sensitivity was actually a limitation or whether it might be one of her greatest strengths. Slowly, Sarah began to hear her own voice again. It was quieter than the harsh voices of criticism, but more reliable. More rooted in love than fear, more interested in growth than in perfection. Her authentic voice reminded her of dreams she had set aside, of interests she had abandoned because they didn't fit someone else's vision of who she should be, of strengths she had forgotten because they had been labeled as weaknesses by people who felt threatened by her light. The process of reclaiming her voice wasn't without its challenges. Linda seemed to sense that something was changing and escalated her efforts to maintain control, becoming more obvious in her attempts to undermine Sarah's confidence. But something had shifted in Sarah's ability to receive these attacks. Instead of absorbing Linda's criticism as truth about herself, Sarah began to see it as information about Linda's own insecurities and need for control. The words still stung, but they no longer stuck. No longer became part of Sarah's internal narrative about who she was and what she was capable of achieving. One of the most powerful realizations Sarah had during this time was understanding the difference between constructive feedback and destructive criticism. Constructive feedback came from people who wanted to see her succeed, who offered specific suggestions for improvement while affirming her basic worth and capability. Destructive criticism came from people who seemed invested in keeping her small, who offered vague complaints that left her feeling confused and inadequate without any clear path forward. Learning to recognize this difference helped Sarah respond appropriately to each type of input, accepting help from those who offered it with love and refusing to internalize the projections of those who spoke from their own pain. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was profound when it did occur. Sarah began to trust her instincts again, to speak up in meetings when she had valuable insights to share, to set boundaries with people who tried to define her reality for her. She started making decisions based on what felt right to her, rather than what would avoid criticism from others. She remembered what she enjoyed doing and began making time for those activities again, even when others couldn't understand why they mattered to her. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah learned to have compassion for the parts of herself that had been hurt by the voices of control and criticism. She realized that the younger version of herself who had internalized these messages had been doing the best she could with the tools she had at the time. The sensitivity her mother had labeled as weakness was actually Sarah's superpower, allowing her to connect deeply with others and to create work that touched people's hearts. The ambition her ex-husband had called selfish was actually her soul calling her toward a life that mattered, toward contributions that would outlast her own lifetime. As Sarah's relationship with her own voice strengthened, she began to notice how many other people were struggling with the same issues. She saw friends apologizing for taking up space, colleagues diminishing their own achievements, women everywhere carrying the weight of voices that told them they were too much or not enough, never just right as they were. This recognition sparked something in Sarah, a desire to help others find their way back to their authentic voices, just as Eleanor had helped her. Sarah began speaking up more in her workplace, not just about her own projects, but about the culture of the organization itself. She started noticing when others were being subjected to the same subtle undermining that she had experienced, and she found gentle but firm ways to redirect those conversations. When Linda would question a colleague's competence in a meeting, Sarah would ask clarifying questions that forced Linda to be more specific and constructive in her feedback. When she heard someone apologizing unnecessarily, she would gently point out that no apology was needed, that their presence and contributions were valued. The ripple effects of Sarah's transformation extended beyond her workplace into every area of her life. Her relationships became more authentic because she was no longer trying to be someone else to gain approval. Her creativity flourished because she was no longer editing herself before she even began to create. Her confidence grew not from external validation, but from an internal knowing that she was worthy of taking up space in the world, that her voice mattered, that her perspective had value even when others disagreed with it. One of the most healing moments in Sarah's journey came when she was able to have a conversation with her mother about the messages she had internalized as a child. Instead of approaching it from a place of anger or blame, Sarah was able to share from a place of understanding, recognizing that her mother had likely received similar messages about sensitivity and emotion when she was growing up. This conversation didn't magically fix everything, but it opened a door to a new kind of relationship, one where both women could acknowledge the impact of generational patterns while choosing to create something different moving forward. Sarah also learned to forgive herself for the years she had spent believing other people's definitions of who she was. She realized that this experience, painful as it had given her a depth of empathy and understanding that she might not have developed otherwise. The woman who had once felt broken by the voices of others had become someone who could help others recognize their own wholeness, who could see through the lies that keep people small and remind them of the truth of who they really are. The relationship with Eleanor continued to be a source of strength and wisdom for Sarah. Their coffee conversations evolved from Sarah seeking help to two women sharing insights about life, healing, and the courage it takes to be authentic in a world that often rewards conformity. Eleanor shared stories from her decades of therapeutic work, helping Sarah understand that her experience was not unique, but part of a larger pattern of how sensitive people often become targets for those who are uncomfortable with genuine emotion and authentic expression. Through Eleanor's guidance, Sarah learned about the concept of energetic boundaries, the invisible lines that healthy people maintain between their own emotions and experiences and those of others. She discovered that her sensitivity, rather than being a weakness, was actually a gift that required proper management and protection. Like someone with fair skin learning to use sunscreen, Sarah had to learn to shield herself from the harsh emotional environments that could overwhelm her natural empathy and intuition. As Sarah's healing progressed, she began to see patterns in her life that she had never noticed before. She recognized that she had often been drawn to relationships with people who needed fixing, who required her to dim her own light so they could feel more comfortable with their own darkness. She saw how her generous nature had been exploited by those who took her giving as a sign that they could take without reciprocating. Most importantly, she understood that changing these patterns would require her to disappoint some people, to let go of relationships that required her to be less than who she was meant to be. The process of setting boundaries was perhaps the most challenging part of Sarah's transformation. She had been so conditioned to prioritize other people's comfort over her own well-being that saying no felt selfish and wrong, even when it was necessary for her health and happiness. Eleanor helped her understand that boundaries aren't walls meant to keep love out, but gates that allow us to choose who and what we allow into our inner sanctuary. A person who truly loves you will respect your boundaries, she learned, while those who push against them are usually more interested in control than in connection. Sarah's transformation at work became impossible for Linda to ignore. The woman who had once been easy to intimidate was now responding to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, asking for specific examples and constructive suggestions rather than simply absorbing negative feedback as truth about herself. When Linda would make one of her veiled attacks, Sarah would respond with calm professionalism, refusing to take the bait that had once triggered such self-doubt and anxiety. The shift in dynamics became so noticeable that other colleagues began to change how they interacted with Linda as well. Without Sarah's reactions feeding the drama, Linda's behavior became more obviously inappropriate, and eventually, The pattern of workplace bullying that had been subtle enough to avoid detection became clear to management. Linda was eventually transferred to a different department, not as a punishment, but as a recognition that her management style wasn't effective for the team's productivity and morale. Sarah's story became an inspiration to others in her workplace who had been struggling with similar issues. Women began approaching her for advice about dealing with difficult people, about finding their confidence in professional settings, about learning to trust their own judgment when others tried to undermine it. Sarah found herself in an unexpected role as a mentor and advocate, helping to create the kind of supportive work environment she had wished for during her darkest moments of self-doubt. The changes in Sarah's personal life were equally profound. She began dating again, but with a new set of standards based on how people treated her, rather than how much they needed her. She reconnected with old friendships that had been put aside when she was too busy trying to fix broken relationships, and she made new friends who appreciated her sensitivity, rather than seeing it as something to be managed or hidden. Sarah also rediscovered her love of writing, something she had abandoned years earlier when someone had told her that her style was too emotional, too personal, too vulnerable for professional publication. She began keeping a journal again, not as a way to analyze her problems, but as a way to dialogue with her own wisdom, to process her experiences and extract the insights that could help others on similar journeys. Through her writing, Sarah began to develop a clearer understanding of the difference between healthy vulnerability and oversharing, between authentic expression and performing emotion for others' approval. She learned that true vulnerability comes from strength, not weakness, from a place of knowing yourself well enough to choose what to share and with whom. This understanding helped her develop deeper, more authentic relationships while protecting the tender parts of herself that needed safe spaces to heal and grow. One of the most powerful shifts in Sarah's journey was learning to distinguish between her intuition and her anxiety. For years, she had dismissed her gut feelings as overthinking or being too sensitive, but she began to recognize that her intuition was actually one of her greatest assets when it came to navigating relationships and making decisions. Her anxiety, she learned, was often a signal that she was trying to force herself into situations or relationships that weren't right for her, while her intuition guided her toward people and opportunities that aligned with her authentic self. This newfound trust in her own inner guidance system changed everything about how Sarah moved through the world. She stopped seeking external validation for her decisions and started checking in with herself about what felt right and true. She began to trust that she could handle whatever consequences came from following her authentic path, even when it meant disappointing others or facing criticism from those who preferred the smaller version of herself. The relationship with her family also evolved as Sarah became more confident in her own voice. She learned to have compassionate but honest conversations about the ways certain family dynamics had affected her, not to blame or punish, but to create space for healthier interactions moving forward. Some family members were able to hear her perspective and make adjustments to how they communicated with her, while others struggled with the changes and needed time and space to adjust to the stronger, more self-possessed woman Sarah had become. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of Sarah's transformation was watching how her healing created space for others to heal as well. Her mother, witnessing Sarah's journey, began to examine her own relationship with emotion and sensitivity, recognizing how her own upbringing had taught her to see these qualities as weaknesses rather than strengths. Her sister started her own therapeutic work, realizing that her dismissal of Sarah's struggles had more to do with her own discomfort with difficult emotions than with any real assessment of Sarah's character or strength. Eleanor, who had become like a grandmother to Sarah, often reminded her that healing is never just individual, but ripples out to touch everyone in our sphere of influence. When we stop carrying other people's shame and pain, we give them permission to put down their own burdens as well. When we refuse to dim our light to make others comfortable, we show them that it's safe for them to shine too. As the months passed, Sarah began to feel a deep sense of gratitude for the difficult experiences that had brought her to this place of self-knowledge and authentic expression. She wouldn't choose to repeat the pain of those years when she had lost herself in other people's voices, but she could see how that struggle had developed in her a depth of compassion and wisdom that she couldn't have gained any other way. The woman who had once felt broken by criticism had become someone who could help others recognize their own strength and resilience. Sarah's work life continued to flourish as she learned to trust her own expertise and judgment. She began speaking at conferences about her area of specialization, sharing insights and research that came from a place of genuine passion rather than a need to prove herself to others. Her presentations were well received not just for their content, but for the authenticity and confidence with which she delivered them. Colleagues began seeking her out for collaboration, drawn to her combination of professional competence and emotional intelligence. The writing that Sarah had returned to as a personal practice began to evolve into something more public. She started a blog where she wrote about the journey of finding your own voice in a world full of competing messages about who you should be. Her posts resonated with readers who had struggled with similar issues, and she began receiving messages from women all over the country who felt less alone in their own journeys after reading her words. What made Sarah's writing powerful was that it came from a place of hard-won wisdom rather than theoretical knowledge. She wrote about the specific moments when she had chosen to trust herself over the voices of others, about the fears she had faced and the courage she had found, about the ongoing practice of staying connected to her own truth in relationships and situations that tested her resolve. Her vulnerability was strategic rather than unconscious, shared from a healed place rather than an open wound. The community that grew around Sarah's writing became a source of mutual support and encouragement. Women shared their own stories of reclaiming their voices, of setting boundaries, of learning to trust their own judgment. Sarah created online workshops and support groups using the skills she had developed in her professional life to facilitate conversations about personal growth and healing. Eleanor remained a constant presence in Sarah's life, a reminder of the power of intergenerational healing and wisdom. Their relationship had evolved into a true friendship, with Sarah now able to offer support and insights to Eleanor as well as receive them. They often talked about how healing doesn't end with the individual, but creates a legacy that can affect generations. How the work we do to break patterns of criticism and control creates space for future generations to grow up hearing their own voices clearly from the beginning. One of the most significant milestones in Sarah's journey came when she was offered a promotion at work that would put her in a leadership position. The old Sarah would have immediately begun doubting whether she was qualified, whether she deserved the opportunity, whether she would be able to handle the increased responsibility. The new Sarah felt nervous about the challenges ahead, but fundamentally trusted her ability to learn, grow, and succeed in the role. In her new position, Sarah made it a priority to create the kind of work environment she had wished for during her own struggles. She implemented regular feedback sessions where team members could share both positive observations and areas for growth in a constructive, supportive atmosphere. She noticed when people were diminishing their own contributions and made a point of acknowledging their value and expertise. She modeled the kind of confident, authentic leadership that she had learned to embody in her personal life. The team Sarah led became known throughout the organization for their collaboration, creativity, and high morale. People wanted to work with her department because they knew they would be supported, challenged in ways that helped them grow, and appreciated for their unique strengths and perspectives. Sarah's experience of being undermined had taught her exactly how to create the opposite environment, one where people could flourish and contribute their best work without fear of judgment or sabotage. Sarah's story continued to evolve as she integrated the lessons of her transformation into every aspect of her life. She learned that healing isn't a destination, but an ongoing practice. That staying connected to her authentic voice required daily choices and conscious attention. She developed rituals and practices that helped her stay grounded in her own truth. From morning journaling to regular check-ins with Eleanor to time spent in nature where she could reconnect with the quieter voices of wisdom and intuition. The relationship with her own body also transformed as Sarah learned to trust its signals and wisdom. She realized that during the years when she had been lost in other people's voices, she had also disconnected from the intelligence of her physical self, ignoring signals about fatigue, stress, and emotional overwhelm. Learning to listen to her body became part of learning to listen to herself. Recognizing that physical sensations often carried important information about relationships, situations, and decisions. Sarah began practicing yoga and meditation not as another item on a self-improvement checklist, but as ways of returning to herself when the world became too loud or overwhelming. She learned that her sensitivity, which had once felt like a curse, was actually a sophisticated guidance system that could help her navigate life with more wisdom and discernment than she had ever imagined possible. The work Sarah did on herself began to influence her approach to all relationships. She became more skilled at recognizing when someone was speaking from their own pain, rather than offering genuine insight or feedback. She learned to respond with compassion to people who were struggling without taking responsibility for fixing or healing them. She practiced setting boundaries that protected her energy while still allowing her to be genuinely helpful and supportive when appropriate. Dating became an entirely different experience for Sarah as she learned to be herself from the beginning, rather than shape-shifting to match what she thought someone else wanted. She attracted different kinds of people, those who were drawn to authenticity rather than neediness, who appreciated her depth rather than being threatened by it. She learned to trust her instincts about compatibility, rather than trying to force connections with people who required her to be someone different than who she was. The romantic relationship that eventually developed in Sarah's life was unlike anything she had experienced before. Built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine appreciation for each other's authentic selves, it provided a safe harbor where both partners could continue growing and evolving without fear of judgment or control. Sarah's partner appreciated her sensitivity and emotional intelligence, seeing these qualities as strengths that enriched their relationship rather than burdens to be managed. Throughout all these changes, Sarah maintained her connection with Eleanor, who continued to be a source of wisdom and perspective. Their conversations had evolved into deeper discussions about the nature of healing, the responsibility that comes with personal growth, and the ways that individual transformation can contribute to broader social change. Eleanor shared her observations about how the work Sarah was doing with herself and others was part of a larger movement toward more authentic, compassionate ways of being in relationship with one another. She created her work, former daughters, Eleanor, each person, looking back, the pain, the strength, Sarah's every time. Sarah's transformation wasn't just personal, but political, not just individual, but collective. A reminder that when we heal ourselves, we heal the world a little bit too. In those quiet moments when Sarah reflects on her journey, usually early in the morning with a cup of coffee and the gentle presence of Eleanor's wisdom still echoing in her heart, she feels profound gratitude for the woman she has become and the women she's been able to help along the way. The voices that once tried to diminish her had inadvertently pointed her toward her greatest gifts, toward a depth of compassion and strength that could only have been forged in the fire of genuine struggle and authentic healing. If you find yourself resonating with Sarah's story, if you recognize the familiar ache of losing yourself in other people's voices, please know that you have everything within you to find your way back to your own authentic expression. The journey isn't always linear, and it's rarely easy, but it's the most important work you'll ever do. Your voice matters. Your perspective has value. Your sensitivity is a gift, not a weakness. And somewhere, there's a woman like Eleanor waiting to remind you of these truths when you've forgotten them. Just as there's a woman like Sarah ready to be that reminder for someone else. The path back to yourself begins with a single choice to trust what you know in your heart to be true, even when others suggest otherwise. It continues with the daily practice of choosing your own wisdom over the criticism of those who don't understand your journey. And it flourishes in the community of others who are on similar paths, all of us learning together how to be fully human in a world that is hungry for authenticity, compassion, and the kind of love that sees people clearly and accepts them completely just as they are. Take a moment right now to listen to your own voice beneath all the others. What is it telling you? What dreams is it whispering? What truths is it ready to speak? That voice has been waiting patiently for you to remember its value, to trust its guidance, to give it permission to be heard. Today might be the perfect day to start that conversation, to begin the journey back to yourself, to discover what becomes possible when you stop trying to be someone else's idea of who you should be and start being magnificently, courageously, authentically you. Your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. And somewhere in this vast world, there are people who need to hear exactly what you have to say, who need your particular combination of wisdom and compassion, who need the reminder that it's safe to be sensitive, safe to be authentic, safe to trust the wisdom that lives within their own hearts. You don't have to wait until you feel completely healed to begin helping others. Sometimes the most powerful gift we can offer is our honest humanity, our willingness to be vulnerable about our struggles and our strength, our commitment to keep choosing love over fear, authenticity over approval, truth over the comfort of staying small. Sarah's story continues to unfold, as all of our stories do, with new challenges and opportunities to practice what she has learned, new relationships to navigate with her hard-won wisdom, new ways to contribute to the healing of a world that desperately needs the medicine of authentic voices speaking from healed hearts. And perhaps that's the most beautiful truth of all, that our healing is never just about us, but always about what becomes possible when we remember who we really are and have the courage to be that person in the world. Whatever the cost, whatever the criticism, whatever the fear. Every day you have the opportunity to choose which voice you listen to, which story you tell about yourself, which version of your truth you're willing to stand behind. Choose the voice that sees your worth, that recognizes your strength, that believes in your capacity for growth and healing and love. Choose the story that honors your journey without making you a victim, that acknowledges your pain without keeping you stuck in it, that celebrates your progress without requiring you to be perfect. Choose the truth that sets you free to be exactly who you were meant to be, exactly as you are, exactly now. The world is waiting for your voice, not the voice that has been shaped by criticism and control, but the voice that comes from the deepest truth of who you are. That voice is still there, still waiting, still ready to sing its unique song into a world that needs your particular melody more than you know. All you have to do is listen, trust, and begin to speak from that place of authentic knowing that no one else can touch, diminish, or take away from you. This is your invitation, your permission, your reminder that you are already whole, already worthy, already enough exactly as you are. The voices that try to convince you otherwise are not your voices. They never were. Your voice is the one that knows your worth, that sees your beauty, that believes in your dreams, that loves you unconditionally just because you exist. That's the only voice that matters. That's the only voice you need to trust. That's the voice that will guide you home to yourself every single time you choose to listen.